That's how it goes sometimes. But he
Okay, we're on. Oh yeah. No, he's great. I'm really thankful for our kids. They're great kids. Well, she's here. She's getting the kids out. Thankfully, she agreed to do that so I could run in and get started. But okay, we're a little light this morning. Looks like. Well, I hope so too, because that make me feel a little bit better. I was really thankful for everyone who made it to the youth event last night as well. It was a good time. But I guess we're already late, so we'll go ahead and get started. John, would you mind leading us in a quick opening prayer? Amen. Thank you, John. All right, so we have been studying Matthew 24, and we got into this because we had been studying some of the hard sayings of Jesus, and it just seemed appropriate to cover this passage when dealing with those things, because there's a lot of stuff that gets misunderstood when it comes to this passage, and then there are a lot of things that are just hard to understand. And so far, I think we're down to about verse 27 in Matthew 24, and that's where we'll begin this morning. But just to recap, up until this point, Jesus has been prophesying about the destruction of Jerusalem. Yes and no, the destruction of the temple and parts of Jerusalem when the Roman army goes in and deals with these things. And so we discussed a lot of things going on during that time period. There's kind of a Jewish rebellion that occurs around 70 AD, and then they go in and they destroy the temple. And Jesus makes the statement that one stone will not be left on another. And one of the reasons that happened, as Grant told us last week, is that the temple had a lot of gold embellishments on it, and when they destroyed the temple, they melted the gold, and so in order to get the gold off of the stones, they had to take them all apart and then melt the gold off of them so that they could get it, and that was one of their goals when they destroyed the temple. But that's leading up into verse 27. That's what's going on. Jesus is prophesying this abomination of desolation. And of course, he references Daniel's prophecy, which that is a direct quote from Daniel. And so we talked about that as well. We talked about Daniel 9 and the similar prophecy that is going on there. Does anyone have any questions, thoughts, leading up into verse 27 of Matthew 24? All right, so there's going to be kind of a shift here in subject matter. Leading up into verse 27, there are several things mentioned about false Christs and stuff like that. At the time that this destruction of Jerusalem happens, there will be many false Christs and several people making claims. And so Jesus mentions that and then kind of segues into a different subject around verse 27. Would someone read for us verses 27 and 28 of Matthew 24?
For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather.
Okay. Now, I'm going to be the first one to tell you, as we get into this next subject, I want to be the first one to own the fact that I'm not sure that I've got everything figured out when it comes to Matthew 24. But at the same time, there are some things discussed here that we can't just overlook and avoid. All right. So we have, up until this point, we're dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem. That's what the prophecy that Jesus has made up until this point is dealing with. But now he says, for just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. And then it says, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Now, what is being referred to here is the corpse. I want to deal with that first.
Based on what he has talked about so far, one could speculate that the corpse he's talking about is what is left of Israel, what is left of Judaism, after this time of they have refused to follow him, they refused to follow the Messiah that they've been waiting for centuries, and so you could say in the sense that their religion is no longer alive. And the vultures would then be exposed to Romans.
Yeah, or anybody else, you know. Right. So you've got a translational question there where you've got birds of prey, right? Scavengers, right? And I'm not sure. I didn't even look at that. I actually did not look at different translations of this particular verse. So I'm not sure what the Greek word is. But the implication there is kind of obvious. They whatever this creature is, they're going to gather. Go ahead.
The word is sometimes it's used specifically to talk about eagles, like the legend of what was the Greek guy who brought fire to people? Prometheus.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's used to mean eagles. However, the word itself just means like large bird.
Yeah.
So it can be a general word for large birds. So eagle is a large bird, vulture is a large bird. It's kind of using it in the same sense that Ezekiel uses birds, or David uses birds when he's talking to Goliath. I will leave your body for the birds.
Right.
That kind of thing. It is literally just referring to that same thing.
Yeah, and that tracks. I would say that with this particular situation that's going on here, if I were to choose a translation other than bird, I would say that vultures is probably completing the image a little more solidly, because what we're talking about here is the destruction of the temple and the scattering of the Jews. And the corpse here, I would agree with Grant in the fact that it's referencing what's left. And so eagles tend to be hunters, birds of prey, but really what's going on here is scavenging. So I would say if I had to parse that out, then I would say yes, vultures is probably a more literal translation. But anyway, so you've got this still talking about what's going on immediately after the destruction of Jerusalem, but you've also got the verse before that you can't ignore, right? So you've got the verse before that references the coming of the Son of Man, and it talks about lightning from the east and flashes even to the west. How is the coming of the Son of Man referenced in other passages that might connect with things like lightning from the east and flashes to the west? Well, that was the one I was thinking of. Yes, referenced like a thief in the night. Every time the coming of the Son of Man is referenced, it's abrupt and it's fast and you're unprepared, right? And it's not fast. It's never referenced fast as in, it's going to happen very, very, very soon. It's always referenced fast in the term of sudden, abrupt, right? So there's a common misunderstanding there. And matter of fact, in Acts, you see people sitting on their rooftops just waiting for Christ to come because their understanding was he's coming soon, right? And there is some scripture to back that, right? When it says Jesus is coming soon, but soon is a relative term, and we understand that God does not operate on our timelines. But there is no confusion about the fact that when it does happen, it's going to happen fast. So I want us to just keep that verse in mind, and I wanted to point it out because there's kind of a transition here in what Christ is talking about, and he begins to reference some other things in the subsequent verses that do not seem to be referring to the destruction of Jerusalem or the time period right after. However, let's get into it to look at what's going on. If someone would read for me verses 29 through 31.
Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. Stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of the trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other.
Okay, before we get into the content of those verses, does anybody else's translation have parts of these passages written in all capital letters? Does anybody know why? Has anybody ever seen this before? Not just in this passage, but in other passages in the New Testament. It's not an uncommon thing. Wow. It's not uncommon for things to be done like this. What's going on in those passages when you have something that's all capital letters like that? So in the Old Testament, when referring to the name of God, whether it's Jehovah is sometimes translated that way, Yahweh is the name that is most often translated as Lord in all lower caps. That is correct. I want us to focus more on the New Testament. When it's done in the New Testament, and you have phrases like this that are written in all caps, some other Bibles may denote these in some other ways. They may have, like a demarcation with a footnote or something like that. There's a lot of ways this can be noted. What's going on when this happens? Typically, what kind of scripture? Yes. Typically, I'm not saying all the time, but typically when you see this kind of thing, it is a reference usually to an Old Testament passage, oftentimes prophecy. And, if I'm not mistaken, usually, as quoted in the New Testament, it is Septuagint. So if you reference back, like if your Bible has a footnote referencing back to the Old Testament, and you go back to that passage and you see kind of a difference between the Old and New Testament quotes of this, it's because the New Testament is usually quoting from the Septuagint, and there are some translational errors in the Septuagint. So, Jesus here is quoting prophecy. He's referencing some things that are said about the coming of the Son of Man here. So let's go back to verse 29. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Now again, what is the tribulation that's being referred to here?
It's going to be a time period right after what he said will happen in verses 15 to 20, that the abomination of desolation would come, and then there would be the destruction of the temple, which is what they asked about in verse 1. And verse 21 even says, then there will be a great tribulation. So that's probably what it's on.
I'd say that's a fair point. And again, people get caught up in that word tribulation, and there is a common doctrine about tribulation. We talked about that last week, about the quote-unquote 7 years of tribulation and how that's taken out of context to reference something that has not yet happened but will happen in the future around the time of the second coming of Christ, right? But it's made pretty clear that whatever this tribulation is that is being referenced in Matthew 24 specifically, it's going to happen not just quickly, but soon. It is almost immediately following the abomination of desolation, which of course is the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. We now know AD 70. And so this tribulation, Christ says, is going to immediately follow, and it's going to be this terrible thing. But what exactly that was, as far as a specific event, is kind of hard to nail down. Because a lot of bad things happened at that time to both the Jews and the Christians shortly following. We talked about last week the kind of the outlawing of Christianity. It was not specifically targeting Christianity, but a law had been passed under Rome that basically stated no new religions, right? And Christianity is largely treated as a part of Judaism until Rome begins to recognize that it is its own religion, and then it becomes illegal, pretty much. And so Christians suffered because of that. It became difficult to be a Christian in the Roman Empire in the days following the destruction of Jerusalem, destruction of the temple and parts of Jerusalem. But also, you've got the suffering of the Jews. You have the Jewish rebellion, and Rome is not kind to the Jews after this rebellion. So you have a lot of things going on. My personal belief, and that's all I can give you on this. There are probably historians that could give you a more accurate picture. My personal belief is that this term tribulation refers to this whole time period after the destruction of the temple in which a lot of bad things happened. But you have a reference here to a prophecy. The sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall. And then Jesus goes on to say, from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. That seems to be a fairly dramatic event, right? You know, even today, if we see an eclipse, which I'm not saying that's what this is referencing, but the imagery would be similar, right? If we see a total solar eclipse, it's a pretty memorable event, right? It's kind of a big deal. So you have that kind of imagery here. You know, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, which of course we know now those two are connected, right? If the sun doesn't give its light, you've got no light on the moon. What's going on with that prophecy? Is it referencing that exact thing? That's the question that I'm asking. Is it referencing the sun specifically being darkened? Or is it more imagery to describe kind of a terrible event or a series of terrible events? Well, There's nothing recorded that I could find that seems to indicate an event. For example, at the death of Christ, right, you have something similar to this occurring. You have darkness for about 3 hours. You have the renting of the veil in the temple. You have the earth shaking. You have this series of events that actually does occur and are recorded, not just by the Bible, but by other scholars of the time. Whereas with this, I could not find a specific event that occurs that would be similar, because it's a very similar description to what actually does happen with the death of Christ. But I could not find an event. So if there's not a specific event in the timeline that seems to exist, I would say that what you've got here is just a description given of a very bad time, right? And again, things were going on after the destruction of the temple. You have the persecution of Christians. You have the persecution of the Jews, both of whom we've already talked about are audiences present for Jesus' prophecy here. So whether or not it speaks to a certain event, there's no question that there were some bad things that were going to happen around 70 AD and following, we now know because of history. But then you've got something else here. And now we get into what I would call speculation, because there are some things referenced here that I don't have the answer to, but I'm not going to avoid talking about them just because I don't have the answer. So let's look in verse 30. It says, "And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all of the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory." If you're looking at this verse by itself and not looking at the context, what is the obvious description here? The obvious answer to what's going on? The second coming of Christ. Matter of fact, the latter part of that, which again is in all caps and tells us that this is a prophecy that Jesus is quoting, the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky. Does that phrase ring a bell with any other passages?
Maybe one that John has been talking about on Wednesday nights.
And that's not the only one either.
Not the only one.
No. There are multiple references to the second coming of Christ specifically that reference him coming on the clouds or with the clouds. As a matter of fact, if you go down a little farther, a great trumpet and they will gather together. Multiple references of a great trumpet. This imagery is used quite a bit when referencing the second coming of Christ. Now, here's where things get a little difficult. Up until this point, what is the timeline that we're looking at? What's going on? What's the time period? And I'll take a general amount of years, but if you want to go with a specific year that the abomination of desolation happened, what's the time period? It's not a trick question. So up until verse 30, well, I'll give you verse 29 as well. Up until verse 29, where he starts talking about the second coming, or what seems to be the second coming, he's referencing events that are happening from anywhere from 70 AD up until, I'll give you probably 110, 120 AD. And honestly, the centuries following up until Christianity is made the official religion of Rome. What didn't happen during this time period. The second coming of Christ. So here's the problem. You have imagery and descriptions, and this is very clearly a prophecy of what appears to be the second coming of Christ, but you also have it referenced immediately after the tribulation of those days. So you've got a time period issue. How do most religious organizations, Christian organizations of the day, deal with this? That may be a difficult question because I'm asking you about doctrine of other churches, but it's important because premillennialism and the rapture and several other, similar doctrines are built from passages like this one. How do they get there?
My experience, they usually say something along the lines of that prophecy in the Bible always has an immediate partial fulfillment and then a future complete fulfillment or something along that kind of rhetoric. So their idea would be that Jesus is describing the events of the first century, but he's also describing the time in the remote future when he will come to judge the world. And that time in the remote future is the complete fulfillment of it, and then the partial fulfillment is what happened in the first century. And so any parts that don't fit their understanding of how this language is used to describe those events in the first century, they say, oh, well, that's the parts that will be fulfilled at the second.
That is a very common way of explaining it. Another one is that there are two prophecies that Jesus makes here. The one referencing the destruction of the temple and the events shortly following, and then a prophecy regarding the second coming. The thing is, it's not easily parsed out, because, like I said, the imagery that's described here is very similar to, I think it's 1 Thessalonians 4, almost word for word, the exact same thing. In 1 Thessalonians 4, we are pretty sure is referencing the second coming of Christ. All right? There is language here that, as he said, John's been talking about on Wednesday night. And what passage has John been dealing with? Daniel. Yeah. So there are some references in Daniel to all of the events that are currently going on while Jesus is prophesying and up to what's going on after. So, I'm going to ask you the question, is this a reference to the second coming of Christ? Well, if it's not, then the question is, what is it referencing? And we'll deal with that first. If it's not referencing the second coming of Christ, which if it's talking about events that did occur after the destruction of the temple, between 70 and let's say 120 AD, so got about a 50-year span there. If it's referencing events that did happen at that point in time and not referencing the second coming of Christ, what is it talking about? It's a difficult question to answer. And I'm not sure that I entirely have that answer. There are some perspectives on it. There are some perspectives regarding the church. My issue with that is the church has already been long established by this point. And so if you go with that route, then you have to explain what's going on with the church at this time that deals with the sign of the Son of Man and the coming of the Son of Man. And again, can't reference Jesus, can't reference his birth, his death, or his resurrection, because those events all preceded the destruction of the temple. So if it were referencing those, and again, some of the imagery is very similar to what actually does occur with the death of Christ. But if he's doing that, then he is now backtracking to events that are going to be happening within the same year versus events that are happening 40 years from when Jesus is giving this prophecy. So that doesn't really track. Now, if it is referencing the second coming of Christ, what's the problem? It did not happen within the timeline that is specified. And Grant, I'm going to ask you, do you have an opinion on that? Because I don't, as to what specifically is being referenced in these verses.
Well, something that is a big, I like malicious danger, but a danger that people need to be aware of, especially if they don't study on this in particular.
Yes.
Is that the imagery that he's using, you've already talked about from the book of Daniel, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this imagery that he's using, sun being darkened, the moon not shining, the stars falling out of the sky, the trumpet sound, the coming on the clouds, is imagery that the Bible uses multiple times. It's not
Yes.
even just from one place.
No.
And describing one event. It's multiple times talking about multiple events. And so a much more beneficial question to consider is, what kind of event is this imagery used to describe in the Bible?
Yes.
And what we see is that it's always a wicked nation being judged for their wickedness, with another nation being used to exact that judgment on them. So it's used in Isaiah to talk about Israel being taken over by Assyria.
Yep.
It's used in Ezekiel to talk about Judah being taken over by Babylon. It's used in Daniel to talk about Babylon being taken over by Persia. It's used in Psalms to talk about the Ammonites being taken over by another country. It's used in multiple books of prophets to talk about those nations being destroyed by other nations, like the Edomites in the book of Obadiah are being talked about with imagery that appears here and imagery that appears in Revelation.
Mhm.
The imagery of really common, really well-known one in the book of Revelation, Jesus coming with his robes dipped in blood, is from the book of Obadiah, talking about God having judged or coming from the judgment of the Edomites. So all of this imagery, the sort of event that it talks about, is not really like the second coming of Jesus per se, but instead it describes, it's used multiple times to describe different events, but it's all the same kind of event. It's a wicked nation that has gone so far in their wickedness that they have incurred the judgment of God.
And to go along with that, because that covers up through verse 30, but then in verse 31, he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. This idea of salvation for the elect, that's not new to Christianity either. Babylonian captivity, the other events that Grant mentioned over and over in the Old Testament, Isaiah, Jeremiah, the prophets, they all mention, God's anger, his wrath, his judgment. But there's always a caveat for those who are faithful. And this,
Lay it out so everyone understands how far back the road goes, right?
Yep.
Angels being sent to ensure the safety of God's chosen people in the midst of the destruction of the evil community they live in goes all the way back
Yep.
to Genesis. Because remember, Lot and his family lived in the city of Sodom, and who gets sent to pull them out?
Yep.
So we even have to go back that far. And you can make the point
Noah.
with what Jesus says a little bit later in this conversation.
Mhm.
All the way back to Noah.
Yeah, exactly. And we are going to get there. And that just illustrates the point that you can't take these verses out of context, because there is a reference to Noah that's coming up, right? But so this imagery is not specific, and that is the prevailing argument. That is the prevailing thought among Christians who study this, is that while this imagery does apply to the second coming of Christ, it applies to the second coming of Christ because it is a like event. It is the same kind of event that has occurred over and over again, and that's why this imagery is used here. And if you look at it from that perspective, and let's say that even if the Son of Man is a reference to Christ, it's Christ's time on this earth while he's living on earth for 33 years, and Christ's second coming. Is that the only time that Christ or a Christ-like being is ever referenced in the Bible? Not a trick question. And something that we've been studying on Wednesday nights as well. Because one of the references to Christ or a Christ-like being, actually a couple of the references, are in Daniel. So, and then of course you have other references to one like the Son of Man. Okay. The idea that Christ participated while he was on earth, his death, burial, and resurrection, and that he will participate in this final event and doesn't participate at any other time, is wildly incorrect. And so if you have, as Grant referenced, the judgment of God on a people at this time, a reference to the Son of Man is not out of the ordinary. And so that's going to take us up through verse 31, where we have this caveat or this clause stating that those who are faithful, he's going to take care of when this happens. And if you're looking at it from a Jewish perspective, the Jews who converted to Christianity, even if they were killed, because I'm not going to sit here and lie to you and say that there were no Christians killed during this period. There were. Matter of fact, during this period, a lot of Christians suffered because of their heritage in Judaism. But what's the great thing about being a Christian in 70 AD if you're killed? It's the same thing that's great about being a Christian if you're killed today. Exactly. So, if God allows Christians to die, even though he says, I will gather my elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other, I'll send forth my angels. He says this, and then he allows Christians to die. Has he neglected to fulfill his promise? No, because his promise is not about flesh and blood at this point. Any comments, questions, or concerns about Matthew 24 up through verse 31.
We didn't get to talk about verses 23 through 26. But I think for understanding 27 and 28, where he says, as lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass is, there the vultures will be gathered too. I think it's important to understand that that chunk right before that, 23 through 26,
Mm-hmm.
he's contrasting that
Yes.
with 27.
Yes.
So 23 through 26, he says, then if anyone says to you, hey, look, here is the Christ, or there, don't believe it. For false Christ and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive people, if possible, even the elect. But look, I told you beforehand, therefore, they say to you, look, he's out in the desert, don't go out. Or look, he's in the inner rooms, don't believe it. Because as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Now, wherever the carcass is, there the eagles, the vultures will be gathered too. So what he's saying is, you're going to get a bunch of people who are going to be trying to make you believe, Christ, he's come, and it's a secret.
Right.
He says, no, when I come, everyone's going to see it.
Mm-hmm.
And then verse 28 is describing this thing that's going to happen, and this is just how it happens. Like, this is how this kind of thing happens.
Mm-hmm.
When there's a corpse, vultures come, right? You're going to see the Romans come to destroy the people of Judea, and that's not my second coming. That's not a sign that Jesus is going to appear. And he's making sure that they understand that, so that when it happens, they're not tricked by anybody saying, the second coming of Christ is happening right now. And
Right.
he's out in the desert, and you have to go there to go see him. No, that's a trick. Or the second coming of Christ is happening now, and he's in this inner room, and it's all secret. You got to come and come and become part of our group to see him. No, that's a trick. It's not what it's going to be. It's like lightning. It's going to come from one end of the sky to the other. Boom, everyone can see it.
And Grant is hinting at some things that were going on during this time period, 70 AD, and leading on up into the 2nd century, with the rise of that type of belief, of this kind of secret knowledge. The rise of the term is Gnosticism. And they had a lot of strange beliefs, but they were prevalent for a long period of time. But this idea of this secret knowledge that you could only gain, particularly in reference to an understanding of Christ, through joining their ranks and all sorts of bizarre beliefs. Yeah. So that was something that they were definitely dealing with. And again, of course, you're dealing with a lot of problems leading up to the destruction of the temple with Judaizing teachers as well. There were a lot of beliefs surrounding Christ, whether or not the Christ that did come and was killed was the Christ, or whether or not he was actually killed. The Gnostics tended to believe that he was not a being of flesh and blood. And so you get into some problems there. But there were a lot of strange beliefs going on. And there were a lot of people, again, you can track the timeline of Daniel. They were still claiming to be Christ or Christ-like, Christ-adjacent. So, and then it talks about Christ or the Son of Man's coming being like lightning. I will say that also, in tracking with what Grant said about God's judgment, it was oftentimes very abrupt and very quick as well. When he gives the prophecy here and he says, you guys are not going to have time to go back home and get your stuff, it's a bad time to be pregnant because you're going to need to move pretty fast. That's because this judgment on the temple and on Jerusalem happened quickly. And you see God's judgment happen rather abruptly, sometimes on a specific scale, for example, when he strikes someone dead immediately, and sometimes on a geopolitical scale, when a nation is wiped out or punished rather severely, rather quickly and abruptly. So, any other comments or questions? Thank you for your participation.